Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I would like to begin by reciting a short chapter from the generous Koran at the request of our guest speaker, Dr. Thomas Cleary. The title of the chapter is The Forenoon. I'll recite first in Arabic and then read from the translation of Dr. Cleary, which is called the Essential Koran, published by Harper, San Francisco. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والضحى والليل إذا سجى ما ودعك ربك وما قلى وللآخرة خير لك من الأولى ولسوف يعطيك ربك فترضى ألم يجدك يتيما فآوى ووجدك ضالا فهدى ووجدك عائلا فأغنى فأما اليتيم فلا تقهر وأما السائل فلا تنهر وأما بنعمة ربك فحدث صدق الله العظيم. In the name of God, the Compassionate, the Merciful. By the forenoon bright and the night when dark and quiet, your Lord has not abandoned you and does not despise you. Surely hereafter is better for you than what was before. And your Lord will surely give to you, and you will be pleased. Did God not find you orphaned and provide you refuge, and find you wandering and guide you, and find you needy and enrich you? So do not oppress the orphan, or refuse the one who seeks, and tell of the bounty of your Lord. The Brazilian educator and activist Paulo Freire has noted that the theme of our age is domination. The domination of industrialized countries over the developing countries, of the corporate world over governmental systems, but perhaps most importantly, the domination of those who know over those who do not know. A former Secretary of State, when grilled by Congress about American involvement in a coup in the South American country of Chile, responded by saying, "Yes, the issues involved are much too important to be left to the Chilean voters to decide." This type of cynicism from these type of people is an example of the way that many of the people that are actually in power look at the peoples of the world. And much of our world, unfortunately, functions at the hands of people who think like this. At this point, it's important to note that this is not some dark conspiracy. Rather, it's closer to Suzanne George's insight, as she's pointed out in her work, that although we can clearly see a great many forces converging together in a single direction, they don't have to conspire if they have a similar worldview, aspire to similar goals, and take concerted steps to attain them. This issue of slavery comes into this theme of domination in a striking way. First of all, the word for slave in the Arabic language is mamluk, which is a passive participle of a verb that denotes dominion. So a slave is the object of another's dominion, which is quite literally the way many people view other people in the world. There are those in political office or the corporate world, for example, who feel they have authority to impose their will upon people simply because they have political or economic dominion over them. While for the great majority of people, government is a system set up to serve the people. And interestingly enough, politicians used to be called a public servant. And business itself is the exchange of goods and services. Exchange would imply mutuality, and services would imply concern. And the word again, serve, is an interesting one because it is a cognate of the Latin word for slave, which is service. So in a healthy world, the government would be closer to being a servant to the populace than the other way around. Or a business would be there to serve the needs of the community, not to undermine them. And equally important, it should not serve the needs of one group by exploiting the labor and or natural resources of another group. All of these are obviously complex themes that need much thought, and ultimately, and more importantly, there are situations that demand ways of being in the world that lead to both liberation and a humanization on a personal and social level. Much of Dr. Cleary's work has been dedicated to accessing for people classical texts from different traditions that elucidate for people exactly those ways of being that liberate and are life-enhancing, as well as humanizing in their effects on the people that employ them and on those with whom they engage. Dr. Cleary himself, after earning a doctorate from Harvard University in East Asian languages and civilizations, has gone on to distinguish himself as one of the finest and most prolific translators of our time. His works are not only marked by scholarly precision, but also by the gentle traces of one committed to the messages within the works themselves. Presenting things not in their best light, but simply as they are, to let others decide for themselves, hopefully with intelligence and deliberation, of what use these works and wisdoms have for us facing the dawn of the 21st century. His writings have impacted untold numbers of seekers and intelligent readers who want to go beyond stereotypes and old cliches about traditions and enter into a dialogue and encounter with the original sources of the traditions themselves. So we are honored that Dr. Cleary has volunteered his valuable time in order to underscore for us the perennial importance of the issue of slavery and the themes of bondage and domination, which are challenges that confront every generation. His approach is always with a fresh perspective and never without the thought-provoking insights of a compassionate soul, hearkening us to look honestly at some of the darker aspects of our human and all too often inhumane follies, encouraging us to embark on a course of action that begins with hope and is based on knowledge. Dr. Cleary has provided us with the practical manuals and tools that enable us to understand ourselves and the world we live in a broader and more meaningful way. And this in itself is a first and major step toward the much needed and desired change all of us wish to see and realize in our lifetimes on this earth. So on behalf of the New School of Oakland, California, and the MSA of the University of Berkeley, I would like to welcome Dr. Thomas Cleary.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. First tonight, I'd like to make it clear that in the case of this talk, the mood is not the message. The mood is anguish, but the message is something else. So if you hear anguish, that just means that you're not dead yet. Now, the reason for holding the meeting on Thursday night is that Thursday night traditionally is the night of the resolver of difficulties. This meeting is being held in honor of the resolver of difficulties, which is a way of talking about the operation of divine wisdom and mercy, and in remembrance of all those who still await justice. And as an offering, I would like to read the chapter Ad-Duha from the Quran in English. In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful. By the forenoon bright and the night when dark and quiet, your Lord has not abandoned you and does not despise you. Surely hereafter is better for you than what was before, and your Lord will surely give to you, and you will be pleased. Did God not find you orphaned and provide you refuge, and find you wandering and guide you, and find you needy and enrich you? So do not oppress the orphan or refuse the one who seeks, and tell of the bounty of your Lord. Now, the overt purpose of addressing the issue of Islam and slavery is because the supposed recognition of slavery in Islam is commonly used in the West as part of the formalized Western hostility toward Islam, trying to suggest that this is the mark of an outdated way of thinking. Now, my purpose is not to preach Islam per se, but common sense. In this case, common sense is that hostility and fear are easy to manipulate. And that means that people are easy to manipulate by means of hostility and fear, and that it's easy to aim hostility and fear at particular targets from outside the domain of those people who are directly involved in that particular hostility and fear. In other words, the people who buy into the formalized Western hostility toward Islam are simply buying into a general program of global destabilization and warmongering. So it's not only unjust to unthinkingly perpetuate hostile stereotypes of any people, large or small. It's also foolish and dangerous. Now, in the case of Islam, since the community of Islam is so large that it comprises about a fifth of humanity, those who mindlessly participate in this sort of bigotry and prejudice are creating a situation, or helping to create a situation, in which the entire earth may be continued to be enslaved in perpetual antagonism and warfare. Now, an ancient Chinese proverb says, if you reconcile bitter enemies in such a way that hostility is sure to remain, how can that be called good? Now, we know that the United States is deeply involved in the Middle East, for example, politically, economically, and militarily. What we have to ask ourselves, I think, if we live here, is how, then, can a peace process, as they call it, in the Middle East, attain maturity when wealthy and powerful and interested third parties are conditioned to pessimism, are conditioned to bias. For example, in this case, Americans have been trained to believe that Muslims and Jews are born in perpetual conflict and doomed to perpetual conflict. The historical fact is, of course, that most real oppression of the Jews has been at the hands of Christians, not Muslims at all. And in fact, Muslims and Jews have cooperated for centuries and centuries, as is well known, for example, in the case of Muslim Spain of the Middle Ages. However, the image of irresolvable antagonism between the Muslim and the Jew is the one that is promoted in this country. So we have to ask ourselves, is this really a sincere attempt at peace when we're being taught that peace is really not possible. So if we're interested in peace, I think the first thing we need to do is not rely entirely on negotiators, but personally not buy into these hostilities and not buy into the belief that they are necessary, inherent, or permanent. Now, on another front, we can observe how the American public is today being sold on the idea of developing Russia and China economically. This year, however, these last few years, the Americans are not also reminded that material prosperity in Russia and China have historically always led to expansionism. That somehow is no longer considered at issue as far as the public is concerned. However, there happens to be an ocean of Muslims between Moscow and Beijing. And I don't think that Americans are well aware of the possibilities that building up Russia and China simply in economic terms, material terms, may lead to serious conflicts in Central Asia as, for example, the Russians or some militaristic elements in Russia may decide that they, after all, do want the Soviet Union back and want to retake Central Asia, or if some military elements in China, and I might remind you that one of the largest investment groups in China is the Red Army, a communist country, but the biggest capitalist is the army. That's something to think about. Chinese have always traditionally marched on Central Asia when they have reunited their own heartland. Now, the point I'm trying to make is this. If America is conditioned to habitually despise Muslim peoples and habitually disregard the rights of human peoples, then where will be the moral compunction to object to the manufacture and sale of arms for local warfare in Central Asia? Supposedly, the reason that the peace dividend, a now defunct word, that was supposed to come after the end of the Cold War, well, didn't come because somehow they felt it was impossible to beat their swords into plowshares. Well, if we're taught to think only in economic terms, and we find that weaponry produces lots of jobs and lots of income, then I think a lot of people here are not going to really care about those against whom that weaponry is used, especially if it's people that they've been traditionally taught to disregard and despise. And let me point out that the world market share of weaponry, the America's share of the world market has gone up from 25% to about 60% in this generation. So I'm not talking about science fiction here when I'm talking about the possibility of lots of widespread, if somewhat limited, war, which is exactly what militarists want. We have to distinguish between warriorship and militarism. Warriorship means protecting the home and family and the land and the womenfolk and the children. Militarism is business. It's making money off of the suffering of other people. Now, if we're taught to think that those other people don't count, and all that counts is us having jobs and income, well, we could be heading for hell thinking that we're going to paradise. I would like to say further, though, however, that I think personally, and I base this on years of experience working in several religious traditions in this country, that formalized hostility toward Islam in America is not just toward Islam. I don't think it is a question of one religion against another. I think it is really hostility toward all religion, the spirit of religion itself. It's really secular materialism against the spirit and soul of religion. I think that Islam just happens to come in for extra heat, partly because of the historical relations, but also because of the piety of the Muslim people who pray 5 times a day. This is something that secular Americans find extraordinary in terms of piety. And the idea that God is really in your life, not just on Sundays, but 7 days a week, well, that's threatening. That is threatening to those who wish us to be nothing but consumers of material goods. Okay, that having been said, let me turn to the subject of legalized slavery itself. And the first thing I think we have to do is distinguish between 2 very different forms of human bondage that have been both labeled as slavery. One is what historians call domestic slavery, which was a product of war, a way of reintegrating captives into society. Then there is chattel slavery. Chattel means possession. Chattel slavery is a completely different phenomenon. In domestic slavery, the individual slave is not deprived of all human rights. The individual slave is no less a human being. And as a rule, in domestic slavery, it is possible for the slave to work for freedom and betterment of his or her condition almost from the beginning. It's not technically necessarily a condition of permanent servitude. Now, this type of slavery was what was practiced in old Africa and old Arabia. Now, chattel slavery, which is totally different, deprives the human of all human rights. The slave is considered property. It's not a human being anymore. This is the type of slavery that was practiced in old Greece, ancient Greece, Rome, and Mesopotamia, which are considered the roots of Western civilization. And this is the type of slavery that was practiced in the United States of America. So when people talk about slavery being recognized in Islam, that does not refer to the type of slavery that was practiced in the United States of America. In the terms of Islam, the slavery that was practiced here in the United States of America was illegal, an abomination, an atrocity. Now, I'd like to look at some of the laws and customs associated with slavery in Islam that will illustrate the tremendous difference between slavery as understood in Islam and chattel slavery as was practiced in this country. In reference to the process of enslavement, there is a sacred saying that on the day of resurrection, God will be the enemy, God will be the opponent of anyone who enslaves a free individual and consumes the profit, or anyone who hires workers and has work done but doesn't pay them. So, while domestic slavery was recognized to the extent that it existed, laws were made designed to integrate slaves into society. Chattel slavery, the laws were designed to segregate, to separate the slave. The slaves were not members of society, they were just like machines. So the whole process of enslavement itself, enslavement is actually illegal in Islam. For profit, that is. Now, freeing slaves is highly recommended, both in the Quran and in the sayings of the Prophet, upon whom be peace. In the Quran, freeing slaves and feeding the hungry are referred to as the high road. And freeing slaves is recommended as expiation for a number of misdeeds, like taking an oath in vain. There was also a special custom of freeing slaves on the occasion of solar and lunar eclipses. And freeing slaves is one of the specifically designated purposes of both the welfare tax, the legal welfare tax, and and voluntary charity. Then again, if there was a jointly owned slave and one owner freed his part of the slave, that former owner was also expected, if he could afford it, to buy out the other owner to completely free the slave. Or if he couldn't afford it, he was supposed to help the ex-slave find work, extra work, to buy out his own freedom, without, however, overworking him. And that is specified, without overworking him. And this kind of stuff that happened here, like whipping and all that, is completely, it's illegal in Islam. Now, to compare the legal situation briefly in the United States of America, of course, those were the days of states' rights, so there were lots of individual differences. But we can get some indication from these examples. In the year 1801, quite late in the history of this institution, a law was passed in the state of Georgia making it illegal to free a slave without previous consent of the legislature. In 1818, it was even made illegal to give effect to a last will and testament, freeing a slave or allowing a slave to work on his own account. Between about 1830 and 1850, which was not long before the end of legalized slavery, and when abolitionism was gathering steam in America, there was a widespread movement throughout the slave states to prevent slaves from acquiring technical skills, which they had been doing. In other words, to prevent them from getting skills which would enable them to get extra work, to make extra money, to better their lot, and sometimes even buy freedom for their families. So what is encouraged in Islam is prohibited, was prohibited here in America. The abolitionists, by the way, who were Christian people and thought instinctively that something was wrong about this, had an awful hard time because they couldn't find anything in the Bible that really made it quite clear once they hadn't recognized that these were people. They didn't know quite what to say. They knew it was wrong, but they didn't quite know why in terms of their Bible. Now, if they had had more information about Islam and had seen the policies of Islam regarding slavery, it could have given them a lot of good ideas for having cleaned up much better after a very bad mistake. Now, regarding treatment of slaves, to begin with, there's an interesting expression in the Quran describing slaves, captive slaves, as those under the control of your right hand. Now, in Quranic language, the right hand stands for justice and righteousness. So this implies that you are obliged to treat those under the control of your right hand with justice and righteousness. Now, the following junctions can be found in the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, upon whom be peace. Your slaves are your brothers, whom God has placed under your control. So whoever has his brother under his control should feed and clothe him with what he himself eats and wears. And do not assign him a task that is too much for him. Or if you do, then help him. And he also said, when your servant brings you your meal, if you do not invite him to sit with you, at least have him take some of the food for himself. For he is the one who suffered the heat of the stove and took pains to prepare it. In addition, education of slaves and intermarriage with slaves are also recommended within the general provisions for marriage. Because Islam did not create an ideology of racism or ethnic prejudice, there was not, well, indeed the very opposite, in fact. There was not the stigma attached to slavehood. And an enslaved person was still a person, and not less of a human being. This, I believe, is the sense of the saying, whom God has placed under your control. In other words, it's not, you're not entitled to exercise your arbitrary whims. Now, the understanding that we find in Islam and this practice were not characteristic, obviously, of chattel slavery. And if we extrapolate over centuries, if we draw out over centuries these two different policies, the one being discriminative and the other being integrative, we can see that they produce very different consequences in society and psychologies. Now, the issue of slavery, and particularly chattel slavery, I'm also using as an entryway into consideration of dehumanization in general and how it can happen in a number of different ways. In the case of chattel slavery, I'd like to focus on three factors which made it possible for this to happen. Three factors which I believe are not in the ordinary historical consciousness of America. And I think they should be, because very similar things continue to happen, and they do also continue to create compromising situations, if not legally formalized, as happened in the days of slavery. The first thing is the destruction of the old trade between Africa and the Middle East and South Asia. This is one of the things that the Portuguese did quite early on in their relations with Africa. I don't know whether this was just a stupid blunder or whether it was actually a tactic, because it could have been either. However, it can be observed that breaking alliances, which is one of the effects of destroying this trade, is a classical tactic of warfare, both military and non-military warfare. So maybe they did it on purpose, or maybe they were just greedy. They certainly did not understand the Quranic injunction to trade among yourselves out of mutual consent. The Portuguese did not understand world trade. Okay, well, besides ruining alliances, the destruction of this old trade also depressed the urban economy of coastal Africa, the urban economies, several economies of coastal Africa, which therefore led to an increased emphasis on slaving for pure economic reasons. Prior to that, the trade in slaves had been very small. Now, the second factor has to do with conflicts within Africa. European slaving nations deliberately intensified these conflicts within Africa in order, one, to increase gun sales, and two, to increase the number of captives available for slavery, because the African peoples would not enslave their own. Then the third factor is the development of racist pseudo-scholarship. This was created and elaborated between about 1650 and 1850, although unfortunately we can see that it still goes on today under the auspices of a group of individuals we may refer to as scholars for dollars. Well, they can do a lot of harm, you see, sitting in their ivory towers spreading a lot of lies. And you know, we sure do put a lot of onus and burden on primary and secondary school teachers to take up the slack for a failing society and disintegrating family structure. But what about upper education? What about the scholars for dollars who in their offices write this kind of stuff without any conscience, without thinking of how it's going to affect other people? Because they've got their chairs, they've got their grants, whatever it is. So I think we should examine, we should be a little more demanding up there rather than expect the poor teachers in primary school and secondary school to make up for all the craziness that goes on. Okay, anyway, I think that these factors are all very significant today because we can still see isolation, division, and traffic in weaponry for profit still retarding human liberty and progress internationally as well as within nations. And I think also the third factor, that is the deliberate creation of racist theory and ideology, is particularly significant today, partly because it does still go on. I think we need to observe it, because by doing so, by observing this activity, we can debunk certain myths, certain suggestions that are now presently being used to further the persecution of people who have already been victimized by racist ideology. And these myths, or these suggestions I refer to, are, one, that racism is intrinsic human nature, and two, that racism is the cause of oppression. Now, I submit that these myths, or I call them suggestions, are purposely promoting despair. Purposely promoting despair. And I also suggest that both sacred revelation and actual history, when studied in depth, that is outside of a limited, bigoted American curriculum, do indeed show that racism is an acquired habit rather than basic nature, and that racism is a manufactured tool of oppression rather than an inherent cause of oppression. Now, as far as sacred revelation is concerned, I'll turn to the Quran. And the chapter of Rome says, "Among the signs of God is the creation of the heavens and the earth, and the diversity of your languages and your complexions. Surely in that is a sign for the knowing." And the chapter Cattle says, "It is God who has produced you all from a single self." And the chapter The Apartment says, "O humanity, we created you from a male and a female, and made you into races and tribes for you to know each other." It doesn't say for you to rip each other off. It says for you to know each other. And the chapter Luqman says, "Do not avert your face from people in arrogance or contempt, nor walk haughtily on the earth, for God loves no conceited braggart." Now, I like to use these sayings for parameters for historical studies as well as for psychological studies. We can see that people who followed these recommendations did prosper, especially culturally, but also economically, whereas those who enriched themselves materially in defiance of these principles always, inevitably, created the seeds of their own destruction. Now let me turn to a historical example that disproves the race or color theory. And this can be found in the English occupation of Ireland, which continued for 8 centuries and decimated the Irish population by enslavement, massacre, and systematic starvation. Now, for political reasons, this story is not told here in the United States. It's not in your history books. And even the contemporary situation is misrepresented. They say that the current Irish rebellion is, what do they say? It's a conflict between the Catholics and the Protestants. Religious war, you see. Actually, it's an Irish rebellion against 800 years of English occupation. The Irish feel that the English, having been there for 800 years, it's about time they should go home. The English feel, well, we've been here for 800 years, we might as well stay. And see, the religious difference was just used as a weapon. You know, it's not really that the religions they're not fighting each other. That's not it. So because the real story of this is suppressed, you really would be surprised. It is blanked out remarkably well. I would like to look, instead of regaling you with the gore of this particular story, I'd like to look at a particular case that will show how this actually affects a much wider group of people than just those directly involved in the conflict. This is an example of a famous Irish writer, Samuel Beckett. I think a lot of people have heard of Beckett. He died not too long ago. He's perhaps best known for his play Waiting for Godot, which has been performed all over the world. Now, we can first get some sense of the distortion of history. When we look him up in the encyclopedia, we find that this Irish writer was an Anglo-French writer who was born in Dublin. Well, the reason for that, I think, is because when he was born in 1906, there was no Irish Free State, and there hadn't been for 700 years. Well, the reality is, of course, he left Ireland because he couldn't stand the conditions in occupied Ireland, and he wrote in French as a protest against English imperialism. Anyway, what I object to is this. Waiting for Godot, which is, as I say, is probably his most famous work and played all over the world, is about people waiting for redemption, waiting for deliverance, so long that they have even forgotten what it is. All that they know is that they are waiting. Well, unfortunately, this was seized upon by secular nihilist intellectuals on the continent. And they raised this poor fellow into the position of the father of the theater of the absurd, and tried to make him a champion of absurdism, which tried to present mankind as having been abandoned by God. Well, as a matter of fact, the reason for this misinterpretation is that the real cultural background is not understood if you consider this man an Anglo-French writer. The reality is that Waiting for Godot reflects the Irish history of having been abandoned by the world, beginning with the Christian world, for 800 years with no end in sight. And, more importantly, it reflects Irish mysticism, the Irish faith beyond hope, waiting even until the end of time for deliverance, which only God can deliver. This is the meaning of Waiting for Godot. Now, because of secular ideology and suppression of one particular cultural background, all in the world who have been reading and seeing Samuel Beckett have been robbed, have been deprived of the spiritual message of faith beyond hope, of perpetual attendance upon the mercy of God. Instead, the message has been interpreted as the opposite. It's not those who are waiting for God who are absurd. It's those who have given up on God. Those are the ones who are absurd. Now, if we can't pin brutality on racism, then what is the cause? Well, the Quran says, competing for more and more distracts you until you go to the tombs. It distracts us from what? From our real nature, from our real potential. In this case, in this particular case, the destruction of Ireland, actually wasn't, the British didn't start this, by the way. It was actually part of the Western Christian attack on Islam, strangely enough. You see, 1,000 years ago, Ireland had its own Christianity, which was mystical Christianity. And they were not against Islam, as we can see from their art and their theology. And you can even see on Irish crosses the Bismillah in Arabic. Well, if you imagine Europe of 1,000 years ago, Ireland up here and Rome down here and there's France in between, and Irish mysticism catching on the continent, the Pope of Rome was worried about being outflanked. So he convinced the Anglo-Norman kings of England to invade Ireland and subjugate it. And so they did. And then, it just became a habit, so they continued for 8 centuries after that. They forgot why they were doing it.